So again, my name is Daigan Gaither. I am a Zen monk, and I'm speaking to you from Ramaytush Lonely Land, also known as San Francisco. And my pronouns are he and him. And I'm really grateful that you chose to join us today. It's always so great when people come together to practice together, to be together, to share space, even in this virtual way. I always just am so grateful that there are other people in the world like me, right? And to be able to fellowship around the ideas of queerness, but also to fellowship around the Buddhist practice and the ways in which those places intersect is really special to me. And this year we're actually focusing on queering the moment or queering the Dharma. And to me, I think that, and we're also in Pride Month. So, you know, one of the, and I say this a lot with, when I'm giving talks to people who are not part of the 2S LGBTQIA plus community. But I think one of the greatest gifts that I have as a queer person is that I, from a very young age, had to examine my life and examine what was important to me. And what it meant for me to be queer. And I think that, you know, it's sort of an ongoing process, but it really did set me up very well for this practice that we share, because this practice is pretty much asking us to do the same thing, right? So queering the Dharma for me, is actually just practicing the Dharma, because our practice invites us to look at ourselves, our lives, our ideas about ourselves, and just figure out, like, well, does that work for me? Does that work for me? Oh, you know, oh, look, here's a bit of a place where I'm a little stuck, or oh, look, I'm noticing I'm beating myself up over this whole thing over here, and maybe I can find a way to ease up around it. Or so, you know, we're constantly invited to just watch ourselves and notice ourselves. And you know, the Buddha said when as he was dying that, you know, the practice exists in the Dharma. It's not about the teacher. And invited us to be a lamp unto ourselves. And that, you know, so whatever teaching that I experience, I'm invited to kind of take it in and sort of see how it lands for me, see and wrestle with it a little bit, and think about, like, well, what does that really mean to me? Just like I did when I was younger, trying to figure out what it meant for me to be a man, a cisgendered man. Like, the invitation to sort of look at that and think, okay, and then are there ways to do that that usurp the problems I have around masculinity and maleness and the patriarchy and the ways in which that's imposed? And, you know, I do the same thing with the Dharma. You know, my teacher says some things, and then I kind of take them in and I work with them a little bit and see how it is, right? And sometimes I hear something and I think, wow, that's a really big piece. That's a really big something. You know, when I first started to practice, I remember hearing this idea of no self, right? And I had grown up in a generation of ACT UP and Queer Nation and worked really hard to sort of get comfortable being queer. And so I was like, well, wait a minute. What do you mean there's no self? Like I'm queer and I like being queer and I don't understand what you're saying here. But the more you practice and the more you sort of try these things on, the idea of not being so convinced by my stories about myself. So like when we were practicing earlier and I invited you to just notice what happens if you can drop your story for a moment, if you can invite yourself to experience something outside of our ideas about it. Can I invite myself and allow myself to see myself with a new set of eyes today at 55 years old, not being so convinced about everything that I think I know. And I think we have that experience in our life, right? Like our whole life growing up, we're taught that we're supposed to be this kind of thing and this kind of way, and this is what it means to be whatever it is that is being thrust upon us. And then as we start to grow up and we realize, well, that's not me. Okay. And then you try out some other things and you realize like, oh, that's not me. And you just keep looking at, oh, and then my ideas about myself change. And that's what no self actually means, is that there's no fixed, abiding, disconnected self. W.S. Merwin has a poem in which he says, everything I think I am is lent to me, which I really love because it says this idea that as I practice, I keep learning more and more about what it means for me to be a person in the world and what it means for me to be in the world in the ways in which I want to be in the world. You know, not the ways I'm expected to be in the world, but the ways I want to be in the world. Who do I want to be today? And the more I practice and the less I'm convinced about the things I have, the ideas I have about practice and being a monk and being queer, the less convinced I am by those things, the more opportunities to learn something new open up. So if I think about, for instance, so I moved into the monastery and I really had this idea about what it meant to live in a community with 65 other people. And then you move in and you realize that that's not how that works, right? Like, because people are still people and they're gonna people. And so I I remember talking to somebody who, one of the senior monks, and I said, I can't not be frustrated and annoyed by all these kids. And and he said to me the best thing that I ever heard, which is, he said, look, some people come here because the rent is cheap. Some people come here to practice and figure this out. Some people come here because it's a nice place to visit on a Saturday afternoon, and then they go about their day. And other people come here because it makes them feel good. And he said, our job as monks is to make sure that all of that is possible. and that shifted something for me, because one, this person I really respected called me a monk, which I thought like it was the first time somebody said, as a monk, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, oh, that's so cool. Especially coming from him. But then also this idea that even what it means to be living together in this space or practicing together in this space, like it doesn't, it's not some fantasy world, it's real life. And so, we bring our human selves into these spaces and then have to figure out what that means. And they often talk about it in terms of, being in a creek, being rocks in a creek, and the way in which the water slowly but surely softens your edges, right? And if you've ever seen river rocks, they're often smooth and round, they're not jagged or sharp. And this idea of practicing so that I can change and alter and learn to be better. So, I'd love to be able to say that he said that and I was magically enlightened and was never bothered again. That never happened. Because I have good days and I have bad days, right? Like we all have these days in which it's just harder to be me. For whatever reason, whether it's my depression or anxiety is particularly loud, or my physical disabilities and chronic pain. But if I attach myself to being, this is what it means to be a monk, and this is how I'm supposed to be, and this is how it's supposed to look, and it must blah, 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 then I'm stuck there. And when my life doesn't fit that model, I'm wrong, I'm bad, right? Instead of just being like, oh, today's a harder day for me to, how do I need to adjust? Today's a harder day for me to practice that way. Today I was copying down the loving kindness meditation for a friend of mine who is ordaining this weekend. And I really got struck by this. And the reason this whole talk sort of came about was because I had this idea of not holding to fixed views, which is the beginning of the last paragraph of the loving kindness meditation. Not holding to fixed views, endowed with insight, freed from sense appetites. One who achieves the way will be freed from the duality of birth and death. But what does it mean to not hold on to fixed views? And I think it's what the Buddha said, right? Like, be a lamp unto yourself. Take this information, take what you find out when you're sitting on the cushion, take what you find out when you're talking to your friends, and try that on. And can I not be so convinced that I lose the opportunity to learn new information? I'm I'm 55, which means in the realm of the world, I am now considered an elder, and I qualify for a lot of senior things. And I'm running up against this idea of what it means to be an elder, what it means to be a senior person. I came out in the late 70s and experienced a lot of stuff, and now you start to look back and you think, if I knew all of that stuff that happened between the late 70s to now, would my life have been easier or harder? I also don't know that I could never imagine feeling this at ease, despite, and we've had such horrible news lately. But despite all of that, and despite all of the sort of reinvigoration of some of the laws around the country and the way they're going after some of our trans siblings, and but I still can feel like it just feels I'm at ease in my own life, in my own skin, in my own expression, right? One of the, there's a great Zen saying, it says, to expound the Dharma with this body and mind is foremost. What that really means is can I take up residence in the body that I have and then live that authentically? And not as some sort of essentialism, but really as a, like, this is the sensation of my body, right? Oh, today it's in pain. Okay. So how do I live authentically in pain, right? Do I try to pretend that I'm not in pain so that I can appear in some kind of way in particular that I want to appear? Or do I just let myself be in pain, use my mobility aids, and ask for help the ways that I need it? And then we figure out, like, oh yeah, so I can change, I can grow, I can expand my view. When I first started practicing Zen, and it was right around the same time that I was working, I started sort of exploring being a chaplain and working in hospice, and realizing that I had been doing that through most of the AIDS pandemic, only I didn't know that there was a word for it. But I remember seeing this sign in one of the hospices that said, it was a quote from Suzuki Roshi that said, "The secret to Zen is two words, not always so." And I thought that was the funniest thing ever. I also like dad jokes. But then the more I sort of really started to think about it, it's like, that's a really big teaching, right? Not always so. And so now I sit down and when I practice, I sit, when I'm meditating, I sit down and I just start to notice these parts of my body, and I notice these thoughts that I have, and I notice how those thoughts arise and how they are connected to each other, and the ways in which this thought gives rise to this thought, gives rise to that thought, and how that creates an emotional response in me. And then I can start to see, like, oh, well, if I back that up a little bit, and I change this thing, then it's a whole different pathway, right? It's like when so when I first started to practice, a lot of the teachers were saying, follow your breath, follow your breath, follow your breath. I try never to say that because I find it doesn't work for me. I have a lot of trauma around my breath, and so it doesn't really speak to me. And it wasn't until later that someone actually said to me, okay, pay attention to your feet. And I was like, you can do that? And he was like, yeah, it's the same thing. Like the idea is to find a sensation that I can return to, that I can rest comfortably on, and that I don't have to control. Like what my feet feel like on the floor. But nobody ever had said that to me before. I remember going to my teacher during one of my first retreats, and I would come in and do all the things that you're supposed to do when you Zen likes a lot of uh, stuff, a lot of ceremony. And so you do this little ceremony before you sit down and talk to your teacher. And I remember sitting down a number of times and being like, I'm really struggling with blah, 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 blah. And he would say, well, don't struggle. And it took me a long time to figure out what he meant by that, because I thought he was being dismissive, but what he was really saying was, what if you just normalize your experience that you're having? What if it wasn't a problem for you to be depressed? What if your anxiety isn't the problem, but trying to force yourself to sit still when you're feeling super anxious is actually the problem? So can we find another way to meditate that doesn't involve having to sit still? Not holding to fixed views, not being so convinced. And we know how to do this because we've done it our whole life. Because at some point we had to sort of realize that everything that people were telling us about ourselves was not true. So queering this moment, queering the Dharma, is really just that. It's just what we've been doing our entire lives. But I'd like to dedicate the merit of our time together, whatever benefit we have. May we offer it to the benefit of all beings, and particularly those who are in danger, those at risk, those suffering from violence. May we all find liberation.